What does it take to turn a multi-million-dollar airplane around mid-flight? Is it a bomb threat or a medical emergency? No, it's a father's love and a quiet war waged at 35,000 feet. You're about to witness how a veteran flight attendant's vicious targeted harassment of a black single father and his baby daughter backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. This isn't just a story of racism in the sky, it's the story of the single phone call that grounded a Boeing 777, ended a career in flames, and proved that sometimes the most powerful man on the plane isn't sitting in the cockpit. Stay tuned, because this twist will leave you speechless. The first-class lounge at LAX was James Vance's sanctuary. It was a world of muted tones, hushed conversations, and the gentle clinking of ice in glasses for a man who had spent the last 5 years in the chaotic caffeine-fueled trenches of building a software company from the ground up. This manufactured tranquility was a currency he had earned. At 34, he wore his success not like a flashy suit of armor, but like a comfortable, well-worn leather jacket. Today, his most prized possession wasn't the sleek platinum card in his wallet, but the 7-month-old baby girl sleeping soundly on his chest. Lily. Her breath was a soft, rhythmic puff against his neck. He adjusted the silk soft swaddle, his large, capable hands moving with a tenderness that was now second nature. He was on his way to Atlanta to introduce her to his parents for the first time. The sale of his company, a logistics and AI firm called Logie Inc., had finally closed 2 months ago. And this trip was his victory lap. Not a celebration of the money, but of the freedom it afforded him. The freedom to be simply a father. He glanced around the Summit Air Ascend lounge. Businessmen in crisp suits typed furiously on laptops. A famous actress discreetly scrolled through her phone behind oversized sunglasses, and a retired couple sipped champagne, their laughter soft as a whisper. He belonged here. His ticket paid for in full, said so. His bank account, a number he still found abstract and unbelievable, said so. But the familiar low-grade hum of vigilance in the back of his mind never fully switched off. It was the lifelong companion of being a black man in spaces where his presence was often seen as an anomaly. Sir. The voice was sharp, edged with a brittle politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes. He looked up. A flight attendant, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, stood before him. Her name tag read Susan. Her smile was a thin taut line. Yes, James replied, his voice calm and even. He instinctively placed a protective hand on Lily's back. I just need to verify your boarding pass for Flight 718 to Atlanta, she said, her eyes flicking from his face to the baby, then back again. It was an odd request, his pass had been scanned at the entrance. Of course, James said, reaching into his Filson diaper bag. A deliberately understated choice that cost more than most people's luggage. He produced his phone, the QR code glowing on the screen. Susan scanned it with a handheld device. It beeped green. Her eyes lingered on the screen. Vance James C2A. That's me, he confirmed. She didn't move. Her gaze was analytical, dissecting him. The casual expensive Henley shirt, the designer jeans, the PC Philippe watch on his wrist, a gift to himself after the first major round of funding. She seemed to be adding it all up and the sum wasn't computing in her head. And the infant, she asked, her tone suggesting Lily was a piece of carry-on luggage that might not meet regulations. Lily Vance, she's on the ticket as a lap infant, James said. The first flicker of irritation stirring beneath his calm exterior. It should all be right there. I'll just need to see a form of identification for you, sir. A driver's license or passport will be fine. This was it. The hum of vigilance intensified. He'd seen this play 100 times. The random secondary screening that was never quite random. He could have argued. He could have pointed out that no one else was being subjected to this interrogation. But with Lily sleeping so peacefully, his primary directive was to avoid conflict. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his bag again, pulled out his wallet, and handed her his driver's license. She took it, her manicured nails tapping against the plastic. She held it up, comparing the photo to his face, her scrutiny lasting a few seconds too long. Finally, she handed it back along with his phone. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Vance, she said, the word cooperation loaded with implication. We'll be boarding first class in approximately 20 minutes. She turned and walked away, her back ramrod straight. James watched her go, a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked down at Lily, her tiny rosebud mouth slightly agape, and his frustration melted into a wave of fierce love. He was doing this for her. He would endure the microaggressions, the questioning looks, the Susans of the world, to build a life for her where she would never have to question if she belonged. 20 minutes later, the boarding call for first class echoed through the lounge. James carefully gathered his things, settled Lily comfortably in her carrier against his chest, and made his way to the gate. He was one of the first to board, hoping to get settled before the main cabin passengers flooded the aisle. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he saw her again. Susan, she was standing at the aircraft door greeting passengers. Her smile, which was at least present for the elderly couple in front of him, vanished the moment she saw James. "Boarding pass," she said, her voice flat. James held up his phone. She scanned it. Another green beep. "Seat 2A, he said, moving to step past her. She held up a hand physically blocking his path. "I'll need to see your ID again, sir, just to be sure." The audacity of it was breathtaking here in the cramped doorway of the plane with other passengers beginning to queue behind him. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't security. It was a power play. "I just showed it to you in the lounge not half an hour ago," James said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "And I'm asking to see it again. TSA regulations are very strict." She lied, her chin jutting out. Behind him, a man muttered, "What's the holdup?" James could feel the heat rising in his neck. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. He was being painted as the problem, the obstruction. He looked at Susan's unyielding face, her pale blue eyes cold and triumphant. She was daring him to make a scene. She was counting on it. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would play her game, but he wouldn't be playing for long. With a deep cleansing breath, he once again reached into his bag, produced his wallet, and showed her his driver's license. Lily stirred against his chest, her little brow furrowing as if sensing his tension. "Satisfied?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. Susan gave a curt nod, her thin lips twisting into a smirk of victory. "Welcome aboard, sir." The "sir" was an insult. James stepped past her and into the quiet, spacious first-class cabin of the Boeing 777. He found his seat 2A, a luxurious pod with its own mini-bar and entertainment system. He settled in, carefully unstrapping Lily and laying her down in the bassinet provided by the airline. She whimpered for a moment, then settled back to sleep. He sat back, the plush leather of the seat feeling like a cage. He had followed the rules. He had been polite. He had kept his cool, but the encounter had left a toxic residue in the air. He looked out the window at the bustling tarmac and knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was far from over. Susan had drawn her line in the sand, and he had a feeling she was just getting started. The first-class cabin slowly filled, an ecosystem of quiet privilege. James tried to reset his mind, focusing on the rhythmic pulse of the aircraft's ventilation system and the soft cocoon of his pod. He accepted a glass of sparkling water from another flight attendant, a young man named Ben, whose smile seemed genuine and untroubled. For a few minutes, as he watched Lily sleep, he allowed himself to believe the worst was over. He was wrong. Susan moved through the cabin with an air of proprietary ownership, her movements sharp and efficient. She avoided his aisle, yet he felt her presence constantly, a prickling on the back of his neck. He saw her engage in warm, familiar banter with the businessman in 3D. He saw her laugh with the actress in 1A. With him, there was only a pointed, aggressive silence. As the last of the passengers boarded and the cabin doors were secured, Susan began her final checks. She walked down the aisle, her eyes scanning each passenger. When she reached his seat, she paused. James was looking at his phone, scrolling through pictures of Lily. He didn't look up, but he felt her stop. "Sir," she began, her voice loud enough to carry to the surrounding seats. "I need to ask you to turn off your electronic device for takeoff. We haven't pushed back from the gate yet." James replied calmly without looking up. It was true. The pilot hadn't even finished his welcome announcement. It is airline policy to have all devices in airplane mode and stowed for departure. She insisted, her tone hardening. I won't ask you again. The man in seat 2C, an older gentleman in a tweed jacket, looked over, a frown on his face. He was holding his own tablet clearly still on. He opened his mouth to say something, but a single ice-cold glare from Susan silenced him. James refused to be baited. He switched his phone to airplane mode, slipped it into the seat pocket, and looked directly at her for the first time since boarding. There. Is that to your satisfaction? Her eyes narrowed. I also need to see your boarding pass one more time. The name on the ticket needs to match the manifest exactly. This was insanity. It was harassment, plain and simple. Dressed up in the flimsiest of official-sounding justifications. The man in 2C audibly scoffed. A woman across the aisle, who James recognized as the kind-looking witness from the lounge, shook her head in disbelief. You have scanned my pass 3 times now, Susan, James said, his voice low and steady, but with an undercurrent of steel she had not heard before. My name is James Vance. My daughter is Lily Vance. We are in the seats assigned to us. What exactly is the problem you're trying to solve? The problem, sir, she retorted, her voice dripping with condescension, is ensuring the security and safety of everyone on this flight. Some people don't appreciate how much work that entails. She was speaking to him, but her performance was for the other passengers, an attempt to frame him as an uncooperative threat. I appreciate security, James said, his gaze unwavering. I appreciate it when it's applied equally, when it's used as a tool of harassment, however. My appreciation wanes. A low murmur rippled through the seats nearby. The tide of opinion was turning against her. Susan's face flushed a blotchy red. She had expected him to fold, to become angry and loud, to prove her unstated assumptions correct. His composure was infuriating her, unraveling her. Just show me the pass, sir, she hissed, her professionalism disintegrating into raw animosity. To de-escalate, and for what he promised himself would be the absolute final time, James retrieved his phone and showed her the glowing QR code. She didn't even pretend to scan it this time. She just glanced at it, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. Fine, she snapped before turning her attention to the bassinet. That bassinet needs to be stowed for takeoff and landing. The infant must be in your lap. I'm aware, James said. I was waiting for the final cabin check announcement. Well, consider this your announcement, she said before stalking off towards the galley. James took a deep, steadying breath, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He carefully lifted the still sleeping Lily from the bassinet, her warmth a calming anchor in the storm of his anger. He settled her against his shoulder, her tiny head nestled into the crook of his neck. This was what mattered. Everything else was just noise. The flight pushed back from the gate and taxied to the runway. As the engine spooled up with a powerful roar, James looked out the window, his jaw tight. The issue wasn't just Susan anymore. It was the silence. The young flight attendant, Ben, had witnessed the exchange and had quickly busied himself in the galley, avoiding eye contact. The captain was sealed behind a locked door, oblivious. The other passengers, while sympathetic, were still just spectators. He was on an island, and Susan was the circling shark. Once they were in the air and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the cabin relaxed. Service began. Ben approached him first, his expression apologetic. Mr. Vance, can I get you something to drink? A coffee, perhaps, the young man asked, his voice low. I'm fine, thank you, Ben, James said, appreciating the small gesture. A few moments later, Susan appeared, pushing the service cart. She served the passengers around him with a forced saccharine sweetness that was jarringly different from the way she'd spoken to him. When she got to his row, she addressed the man in 2C. And for you, sir, she chirped. After taking his order, she moved to push the cart past James's seat without a word. It was such a petty, childish act of aggression that James almost laughed. He was a multi-millionaire, a titan of his industry, being pointedly ignored during a drink service like a misbehaving schoolboy. Excuse me, James said, his voice cutting through her performance. I'd like a bottle of water, please. Susan stopped. She turned back to him slowly, her face a mask of irritated compliance. Still or sparkling? She asked, her tone flat. Still is fine. She retrieved a small plastic bottle and a glass, placing them on the tray in front of him with a clatter that was just a little too loud. As she did, Lily, startled by the noise, let out a sharp cry. James immediately went into father mode, murmuring softly to her, rocking her gently. Her cries quickly subsided into soft whimpers. Susan, however, rolled her eyes with theatrical flair. Great, she muttered just loud enough for him to hear. It's going to be one of those flights. That was the moment something inside James shifted. The irritation, the frustration, the tightly controlled anger, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. This was no longer about his own pride or enduring disrespect. This was about his daughter. Susan hadn't just insulted him. She had made his child's discomfort a source of her own disdain. She had made Lily a target. He looked at Susan, who was now moving down the aisle, completely oblivious to the line she had just crossed. She thought she was winning, that her campaign of petty torments was working. She had no idea that she wasn't just having a bad day or dealing with a difficult passenger. She was sealing her own fate, one hostile comment at a time. James pulled out his phone. He didn't turn it on. He just held it in his hand, a tangible reminder of the power he possessed, but had so far refused to use. He had wanted a peaceful flight. He had wanted to avoid a scene. But Susan was leaving him no choice. The question was no longer if he would act, but how and when. And he knew with chilling certainty that it would be on his terms and it would be decisive. The turbulence was just beginning. An hour passed. James managed to get Lily back to sleep, a small victory in the pressurized tension of the cabin. He had declined a meal, wanting nothing from Susan, and had created a small quiet bubble for himself and his daughter. He read a book on his phone, the noise-canceling headphones blocking out the drone of the engines, and he hoped the toxicity radiating from the lead flight attendant. But Susan was relentless. She seemed to have invented reasons to be in his vicinity. She restocked the minibar in the empty seat in front of him with unnecessary vigor. She collected trash from the man in 2C with an extended deliberate reach over James' personal space. Each action was a small calculated intrusion designed to needle and provoke. The breaking point when it came was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, vicious escalation that left no room for ambiguity. Lily began to fuss. It was time for a diaper change. It was a simple universal reality of parenting. James gathered the diaper bag, stood up carefully, and prepared to make his way to the spacious first-class lavatory at the front of the cabin. As he stepped into the aisle, cradling his daughter, Susan materialized as if from thin air, blocking his path. She held a silver coffee pot in her hand. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked. Her stance was confrontational, her body language that of a bouncer, not a flight attendant. "I'm going to the lavatory to change my daughter's diaper," James stated, keeping his voice neutral. Susan's lips curled into a sneer. "The cabin is not your personal nursery. We have other passengers to consider." "I am aware," James said, his patience stretched to a molecule-thin wire. "That's why I'm going to the private room specifically designed for this purpose. The captain has requested that the forward galley and lavatory area be kept clear for the time being." She lied. It was a blatant, easily disprovable falsehood. The area was empty, and no such announcement had been made. The woman across the aisle, Claire, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, spoke up. "That's not true," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I was just up there 2 minutes ago." Susan shot Claire a venomous look before turning her attention back to James. "My instructions are for right now. You'll have to wait." "Wait for what?" James asked. "She needs to be changed now. It's a matter of hygiene for her and for everyone else on this plane." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you brought a baby into a confined space for 6 hours." Susan shot back, her voice low and venomous. "This is a first-class cabin, not a daycare center." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was an An attack on his parenting, his daughter, his very right to exist in this space. The other passengers who overheard gasped. Ben, the junior flight attendant who was at the back of the cabin, saw the confrontation and froze, his face pale. James looked down at Lily, who was now beginning to cry in earnest, her small face turning red. He looked at Susan's smug, hateful expression. He felt the eyes of everyone on them. He had been pushed, prodded, and provoked, and he had absorbed it all with a stoicism forged over a lifetime. But this was a line that could never be uncrossed. He adjusted Lily in his arms, his movements calm and deliberate. "Step aside, Susan," he said. His voice was quiet, but it held a new authority, a finality that made even her pause. "I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft," she snarled, emboldened by what she perceived as his lack of options. "You will do as I say. I need to see your identification. Right now." "You want to see my ID?" James repeated, not as a question, but as a statement of utter disbelief. "Right now, while I'm holding my crying child who needs her diaper changed, you are demanding to see my ID for the 4th time on this trip. I have reason to believe you may not be the person on this ticket," she said, her voice rising. She was going all in, committing to the ugly fantasy she had constructed in her head. "You don't seem to fit the profile." "Fit the profile?" James asked. The words landing like stones in the silent cabin. "And what profile is that, Susan?" "The one where a black man can't possibly have earned his way into C2A. The one where a father traveling alone with his child is automatically a threat." "I don't have to explain myself to you," she spat. "Show me your ID or I will have the captain radio ahead and have you detained upon landing." The threat was the final desperate move of a bully who had lost control. James looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see a flight attendant. He saw a gatekeeper of a small sad kingdom of prejudice wielding her minor authority like a weapon. And he knew that simply reporting her after the flight would be insufficient. A complaint letter would be filed away. She might get a slap on the wrist. But the rot, the systemic rot that allowed a Susan to flourish would remain. Justice in this case couldn't be a memo. It had to be a statement. A slow, cold calm settled over him. It was the same feeling he'd had when he decided to bet his entire life savings on his startup. It was the feeling of absolute certainty. "You're right," James said softly. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." He turned not towards the back of the plane, but back to his seat. The other passengers watched, confused. Susan's face wore a look of smug triumph. She thought she had one. She thought she had broken him and put him back in his place. James sat down in seat 2A. He settled a still crying Lily into his lap, murmuring to her, "It's okay, baby girl. Daddy's going to fix this. Everything is going to be okay." He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out his phone. He ignored the airplane mode warning. He went to his contacts to a name at the very top of his favorites list. A name he hadn't had to call in over a year. Richard Sterling, CEO, Summit Air. Susan watched him, a scornful look on her face. "Who are you calling? The complaint department? They don't open for another 3 hours." James didn't answer. He pressed the call button. The Wi-Fi calling feature, a standard perk in first class, connected instantly. It rang once, twice. "James," a voice answered, rough with sleep, but instantly alert. "Is everything all right? It's 4 a.m. on the West Coast." Susan's smirk faltered. The easy familiarity in the voice on the other end of the line was not that of a call center employee. "Richard, my apologies for the early call," James said, his voice as smooth as glass. "I'm afraid we have a situation." He looked up from his phone and met Susan's gaze. He saw her bravado begin to crumble, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a dawning horror. "I'm on your flight 718 from LAX to Atlanta," James continued, his eyes locked on hers. "And I need you to do something for me. I need you to cancel it." There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the line. The only sound, the faint hum of the server connecting the call from 35,000 feet to a mansion in Bel Air. Susan's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, was now a canvas of disbelief. Her jaw went slack. The coffee pot in her hand tilted precariously. She was trying to process the name Richard as in Richard Sterling, the man whose face was on the cover of their in-flight magazine, the CEO of Summit Air. Cancel it. Richard Sterling's voice crackled back, now wide awake. James, what are you talking about? Is there a security threat? A mechanical issue? Talk to me. The threat, Richard, is to your brand, James said, his voice remaining level, almost unnervingly serene. He never broke eye contact with Susan, forcing her to bear the full weight of the moment she had created. The issue is with your personnel, specifically the lead flight attendant in my first-class cabin. He could hear Sterling moving, sitting up in bed. Personnel, what's going on? Let's just say the level of customer service has devolved into outright harassment, James explained calmly. It started in the lounge and has escalated to the point where I am being blocked from using the lavatory to care for my daughter and being threatened with detainment upon arrival. All because your employee Susan doesn't believe a black man belongs in her cabin. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. The passengers nearby who could hear the one-sided conversation were now sitting bolt upright, their eyes wide. This was no longer just an uncomfortable scene. It was a corporate crisis unfolding in real time. Get me her name, Richard said, his voice now glacial. Get me the captain's name. Her name is Susan, James replied. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting the captain as I've been a bit preoccupied being racially profiled for the last 2 hours. This is unacceptable. Sterling snapped. He wasn't talking to James anymore. He was processing his CEO brain kicking into high gear. The liability, the PR nightmare, the sheer injustice of it. A formal complaint will be filed. She will be dealt with. James, I give you my word. She'll be fired before you land. This was the response James had expected. It was the standard corporate-approved damage control, but it wasn't enough. Not this time. No, Richard, you're not hearing me, James said firmly. A complaint isn't enough. Firing her isn't enough. This plane does not continue to its destination. Not with her on it, and frankly, not with me on it. The entire experience, this whole flight is tainted. It's a wash. James, you can't be serious. Sterling pleaded. There are over 200 other people on that plane. The logistics, the cost, it would be a nightmare. I sold my company, Logie Inc., for 9 figures, Richard, James stated, not to brag, but to make a point. Your airline uses my software to manage your global logistics. You know, I understand the cost. I also understand the cost of allowing a culture of prejudice to fester within your organization. This incident isn't a bug. It's a feature of a system that is failing. You need to send a message that this is a zero-tolerance issue. And that message needs to be loud, clear, and immediate. It needs to be inconvenient. It needs to hurt. Susan was now white as a sheet. Her hand trembled and the coffee pot clattered as she placed it on a nearby countertop. She looked wildly from James to the other passengers as if searching for an ally, but found only condemnation in their stares. What do you want me to do? Richard asked, his voice strained. He knew James. He knew he wasn't bluffing. James Vance was one of the most principled, stubborn men he had ever dealt with in business. It's simple, James said, laying out the terms as if he were negotiating a venture capital deal. This flight does not proceed to Atlanta. It turns around and goes back to LAX. You will cite unforeseen operational issues. When we land, I expect a corporate representative, not airport security, not the police, but someone from your executive office to meet the plane. They will take my statement and they will handle Susan. My private car will be waiting on the tarmac to take me and my daughter home. Summit Air will cover all costs and damages, the details of which my lawyers will be in touch about tomorrow. And you and I, Richard, will have a very serious conversation about a top-to-bottom diversity and anti-bias training overhaul for your entire company. He paused, letting the demands sink in. If you do this, this story ends today right here on this plane. If you don't, I will deplane in Atlanta. I will call the New York Times and the name Summit Air will be synonymous with bigotry by the 6 o'clock news. Your stock will drop and this will cost you 100 times more than turning one plane around. The choice is yours. The silence on the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Susan looked like she was going to be physically sick. The man in 2C had his phone out and was surreptitiously recording. Claire, the woman across the aisle, simply watched James with an expression of profound respect. Finally, Richard Sterling's voice came back heavy with resignation. Turn around approved. The order is going to the cockpit now. A representative will meet you at the gate. I am profoundly sorry, James. This should never have happened. I know, James said, and he disconnected the call. He slipped his phone back into his pocket. He looked at Susan, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure panic. The bully had been stripped of her power, and all that was left was a pathetic, frightened woman who had just flown her own career directly into a mountain. Less than a minute later, the intercom crackled to life. It was the captain's voice laced with a new palpable tension. Folks, this is your captain speaking. Apologies for the interruption. Due to unforeseen operational circumstances, we are unable to continue our flight to Atlanta at this time. We will be turning the aircraft around and returning to our departure point at Los Angeles International Airport. Cabin crew, please prepare the cabin for landing. We will provide more information once we are on the ground. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. A wave of confusion and groans swept through the entire plane. In economy, passengers looked at each other bewildered. In first class, a handful of people knew exactly what the operational circumstance was. It was a 5 feet 5 inches flight attendant with blonde hair and a toxic sense of entitlement who was now leaning against the galley wall, her face ashen, looking at James Vance as if he were the executioner. And in a way, he was. He hadn't just ended her flight, he had ended her world. The flight back to LAX was the strangest 90 minutes of air travel James had ever experienced. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was thick with tension that could have been cut with a knife. The announcement had sent a shock wave through the plane. And while the majority of passengers in the main cabin were merely frustrated and confused, those in the front rows were participants in a silent high-stakes drama. Susan had vanished. After the captain's announcement, she had stumbled into the forward galley and drawn the curtain. Ben, the junior flight attendant, was left to manage the entire first-class cabin alone. He moved with a nervous apologetic energy, offering water and blankets, his eyes constantly flicking towards the curtained-off galley as if expecting a monster to emerge. He meticulously avoided looking at James, not out of malice, but out of what seemed to be a mixture of fear and shame. James, for his part, was an island of tranquility. He had done what needed to be done. The anger had receded, replaced by a weary sense of resolution. He finally changed Lily's diaper in the now uncontested lavatory, his movements unhurried. He then sat with her in his lap, humming softly as she gazed out the window at the endless blue sky, blissfully unaware of the chaos she had been at the center of. The other passengers watched him with a newfound respect, bordering on awe. He was no longer just a man with a baby. He was the man who had stopped a plane. The man in 2C gave him a subtle approving nod. Claire, the woman across the aisle, caught his eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you." She understood this wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel small, out of place, or less than by someone in a position of authority. The descent into Los Angeles was swift. As the plane taxied towards a secluded gate away from the main terminal, the reality of the situation began to set in. This wasn't a normal arrival. When the seatbelt sign switched off, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a different tone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground at LAX. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until we have been cleared by ground staff. First-class passengers, we ask for your patience. You will be deplaning first, but please wait for instructions. Minutes later, two figures appeared at the cabin door. They were not the usual ground crew. The first was a stern-faced man in a pilot's uniform with 4 stripes on his shoulder, the captain. The second was a woman in a sharp dark blue Summit Air corporate suit, her face a mask of professional gravity. This was the representative Richard Sterling had promised. The captain strode directly to the forward galley and pulled back the curtain. "Susan," he said, his voice low, but carrying the unmistakable ring of command. "With me now." Susan emerged, looking like a ghost of the woman she had been 2 hours prior. Her severe bun had come loose, with strands of hair framing a pale, tear-streaked face. Her uniform looked rumpled. She refused to look at any of the passengers, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. The woman in the corporate suit stepped forward, addressing the small group in first class. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Catherine Cole, Vice President of In-Flight Services for Summit Air. On behalf of our CEO, Richard Sterling, and the entire company, I want to extend our most sincere and profound apologies for this disruption. This is not the standard of service or safety we aspire to. A full investigation is being launched effective immediately." Her eyes found James. "Mr. Vance, if you'll come with me, your car is waiting." The captain was speaking to Susan in a low, furious tone. "Your credentials, your ID. Hand them over. You are suspended pending termination. You will be escorted from the premises." Susan fumbled in her bag, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp her wallet. She handed over her airline ID. The plastic card that had been her symbol of power was now evidence in her professional execution. As James gathered Lily in his bag, the other passengers finally began to murmur. The story in fragmented pieces was spreading. "He called the CEO," someone whispered. "She wouldn't let him change his baby's diaper," said another. The narrative was cementing, and Susan was its villain. James walked towards the door with Miss Cole at his side. As he passed Susan and the captain, Susan looked up, her eyes filled with a desperate, venomous plea. "You've ruined my life," she choked out, her voice a raw whisper. James paused. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a kind of detached pity. "No, Susan," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You did. You built a world based on judging people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. Today, you just finally had to live in it." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked out of the aircraft and onto the jet bridge, which led not to the terminal, but to a set of stairs descending directly to the tarmac. A black Cadillac Escalade was parked there, its engine humming. The full karmic weight of the situation hit him as he stepped out into the California sunshine. The massive Boeing 777, a marvel of engineering worth over $300 million, sat silent and empty behind him. Its journey was stopped. Its schedule shattered, its hundreds of passengers displaced, all because one woman could not fathom the idea of a black man in first class. Catherine Cole opened the door of the Escalade for him. "Mr. Vance, I cannot apologize enough. We have a suite reserved for you at the Four Seasons if you need it. We are rebooking all other passengers with a full refund and a $1,000 travel voucher. Whatever you need, it's yours." "I just want to go home," James said, carefully securing Lily into the car seat that was already waiting for them. "And I want this to never happen to anyone else again." "Mr. Sterling is taking this with the utmost seriousness," she assured him. "The meeting you discussed is already on his calendar." As the Escalade pulled away, James looked back at the plane. He could see a small group by the terminal door, the captain, a few ground staff, and the solitary defeated figure of Susan being led away by airport security. Her career was over. Her reputation was in ashes. But James knew this wasn't the end. The initial karma had struck. The hard karma was yet to come. The man in 2C had been recording. And in the digital age, stories like this had a life of their own. Susan wasn't just fired. She was about to become infamous. Hold on tight, because the next part of this saga will shock you even more. The story did not end when the Escalade pulled away from the tarmac. In the vacuum of information left by Summit Air's vague operational circumstances announcement, speculation had been running rampant online. But the truth, as it often does, found a way out. The man from 2C, a tech investor from Palo Alto named Greg, had not just recorded the final confrontation. He had been taking notes. He respected James' decisive, no-nonsense approach and was disgusted by what he had witnessed. While waiting in the chaos of the rebooking line at LAX, he uploaded his 45-second video clip to Twitter. He paired it with a detailed eyewitness account of the entire ordeal from the lounge to the final chilling threat. He tagged Summit Air, several major news outlets, and used the hashtag #SummitSusan. By the time James and Lily arrived back at their quiet, sun-drenched home in the Hollywood Hills, the story was already a Category 5 hurricane on social media. The video was explosive. It clearly showed James holding his crying baby, calmly asking to use the restroom and Susan blocking him, her face contorted with malice as she spat the words, "Fit the profile." It was a raw, undeniable portrait of modern-day prejudice. #SummitSusan trended globally within 3 hours. News outlets smelling blood in the water pounced. The New York Times, CNN, the BBC, they all ran the story, juxtaposing the viral video with Summit's flailing corporate statements. Susan's full name was quickly discovered by internet sleuths, her digital footprint scraped clean. But not before screenshots of past problematic social media posts were unearthed and circulated, painting a picture of a woman with a long history of bigoted views. She became the face of corporate racism in America. The karma was no longer just about being fired. It was a public scorching. She was doxxed. She received threats. She was pariah, unable to leave her home. Every news story about the incident was a fresh nail in the coffin of her public life. Job offers in any customer-facing industry, let alone aviation, would be non-existent for the rest of her life. She had lost her career, her privacy, and her anonymity in a single self-immolating act of prejudice. But for James, the public fallout was just noise. His focus was on the promise he'd made to Richard Sterling. 2 days later, he wasn't in a lawyer's office. He was in the Summit Air corporate headquarters, sitting across a vast mahogany table from its CEO. Richard Sterling looked exhausted. "The board is in full-blown panic," he said, foregoing any pleasantries. "The stock is down 11%. This is a catastrophe." "It's an opportunity, Richard," James countered, his voice firm. "It's a chance to do something real. Your standard diversity seminars are useless. They're corporate box checking. You teach people how to avoid lawsuits, not how to change their hearts and minds. So, what do you propose?" Sterling asked, leaning forward, desperate for a lifeline. "You hired my company to fix your logistics because you had a systemic problem. You have another systemic problem now," James explained. "I want you to fund a new initiative, a foundation run independently, but funded by Summit Air. Its sole purpose will be to develop and implement what I'm calling applied empathy training. We won't use actors and role play. We'll use virtual reality, first-hand testimonials, and data-driven analysis to show employees what bias actually feels like. We'll put them in the shoes of the people they profile." He slid a proposal across the table. It was detailed, visionary, and expensive. "And I want Ben, the junior flight attendant from that flight, to be one of the first advisors. He was scared, but he was decent. He's the kind of person you need to build around. People who are willing to be better." Sterling read the proposal, his eyes widening at the scope and the budget. It was audacious. It would cost millions. But it was also brilliant. It wasn't just an apology. It was a solution. A way to turn the biggest PR disaster in the airline's history into a pioneering story of redemption and change. "You'd do this?" Richard asked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You'd help us." "I'm not doing it for you, Richard," James said, his gaze softening as he thought of his daughter. "I'm doing it for Lily. I don't want her to have to make the same phone call I did in 30 years. Summit Air accepted the proposal. The Vance Sterling Initiative for Applied Empathy was announced a week later with James as its co-chair. It made headlines for all the right reasons, lauded as a groundbreaking step forward in corporate responsibility. The hard karma for Susan was a life of public shame and professional exile, a direct consequence of her own actions. But the true lasting karma wasn't just her downfall. It was the rise of something better in the ashes of the crisis she had created. It was in the new training modules that every single Summit Air employee, from the CEO to the baggage handlers, was now required to pass. It was in the story of Ben, the junior flight attendant, who became a respected voice for change within the company. Months later, James was on another Summit Air flight, this time with his parents, heading for a rescheduled family vacation. A new flight attendant, a young woman he'd never seen before, knelt by his seat. "Mr. Vance," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "I just wanted to say thank you. I just finished the new VSSI training. It changed the way I see everything." James looked over at Lily, now babbling happily in her grandmother's arms. He smiled, a true unburdened smile. He hadn't just cancelled a flight. He had cleared the air, creating a turbulence of a different kind, one that had shaken a corrupt system to its foundations and charted a new course for everyone who came after. That was a victory worth more than any price. 1 year later, the name Susan Collins was a ghost. She lived in a small, nondescript apartment in a different state under a different name. Her blonde hair was now a mousy brown, cut short and practical. The severe bun and the crisp Summit Air uniform were ghosts of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her new job was at an industrial laundry facility, the air thick with the smell of bleach and steam. It was anonymous, grueling work. She folded linens for hotels and hospitals, her hands raw, her back aching. It was the only job she could get after her face had been plastered across every news channel and social media feed for a month. The karma wasn't just the loss of her career. It was the deafening silence of her new existence. No authority, no pride, no one to impress or intimidate. She was invisible. Some days the bitterness was a physical ache. She would blame James Vance, the internet, the woke mob, anyone but herself. But on other harder days, in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above the folding tables, the truth would visit her. She would remember the look on James's face, not of anger, but of profound disappointment. She would remember the sound of a baby crying. She would remember the cold, hard certainty in her own voice as she spat the words, "Fit the profile." And in those moments, she knew she had earned this silence. She had built her own prison. One evening, waiting for a bus, she glanced at a public television screen in a storefront window. A local news segment was on, celebrating a hometown hero. The face on the screen was familiar. It was Ben, the young flight attendant from Flight 718. He wasn't in a uniform. He was in a sharp suit standing on a stage speaking with a confidence that stunned her. He was now the executive director of the Vance Sterling Initiative. He spoke about the program's expansion, its adoption by 3 other major airlines, and its measurable success in reducing passenger complaints and increasing employee satisfaction. "We don't just teach tolerance," Ben said to the reporter, his voice clear and passionate. "We teach understanding. We put people in situations they've never been in. We show them the world through another person's eyes. It's not about changing policies. It's about changing perspectives, one employee at a time." Susan watched, frozen, as the bus pulled up and then drove away without her. She saw not just the success of the man she had once terrorized, but the vibrant, positive world that had been built directly on the crater she had left behind. Her hatred had become the fertilizer for something beautiful, and she was not allowed to be a part of it. That was the hardest karma of all. She turned away from the screen and walked home in the rain, a ghost haunted by the world she had helped create. For James, that year had been one of purpose. The VSSI had become more than a side project. It was a passion. He had found that the skills he'd used to build a tech company, strategy, innovation, and scaling were perfectly suited to building a movement. He sat now in a simulated airplane cabin at Summit Air's main training facility, watching the initiative in action. He was observing Ben lead a session for new pilots. Ben commanded the room with a quiet authority, guiding the trainees through a VR module that simulated the experience of being a Muslim woman in a hijab, receiving suspicious stares in an airport. He then followed it with a simulation of being a parent with a disabled child struggling to navigate security. The pilots emerged from the experience visibly affected, their usual cockpit bravado replaced by a humbled, thoughtful silence. After the session, Ben came over to James, loosening his tie. "How'd I do, boss?" "You don't call me boss, Ben?" James smiled. "And you were incredible. You're a natural leader." "I had a good teacher," Ben said earnestly. "That day on the flight, I was ashamed of how I reacted or how I didn't react. I just froze. I never wanted to feel that powerless to do the right thing again." "You weren't powerless, Ben." James corrected him gently. "You were kind. In a situation like that, kindness is a form of courage. You just needed a chance to find your voice. Now look at you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the next group of employees file in. The culture was changing. It was slow, incremental work, but it was real. James had learned that you couldn't extinguish prejudice entirely, but you could make it socially and professionally unacceptable. You could build systems that favored empathy over suspicion, and you could empower the good people like Ben to lead the way. The story of James Vance isn't just about one man's victory over prejudice. It's a powerful reminder that real change often requires more than just a complaint. It demands a consequence. James used his power not for revenge but for reform, transforming a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change that would affect thousands. He proved that one person's refusal to accept injustice can in fact redirect the course of a massive corporation. This story challenges us to ask ourselves, what would we do in that situation? Would we stay silent or would we be brave enough to ground the plane? If this story of justice and accountability resonated with you, please help us share it. Hit that like button to show your support and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful true stories that matter, only on Dark Stories. And now we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think was the most powerful moment in this entire saga. Thank you for watching.